Welcome, friends and seekers of history, to a journey back to the heart of medieval France. Tonight, we invite you to walk in the footsteps of one of the world's most extraordinary souls, Joan of Arc. Her story is one of faith, courage, and sacrifice against unimaginable odds. Through fire and trial, Joan's spirit changed the course of history and inspired centuries of hope. Settle in. Let your mind drift back through time and allow this true tale of martyrdom and destiny to guide you into the night. Like and subscribe for more immersive journeys into history's most powerful stories. Let us pause to imagine the world into which Joan of Arc was born. A realm of war, hunger, and fear, but also of hope and whispered miracles. As you listen, picture the silent villages, the echo of church bells, and the dreams of a peasant girl whose faith would challenge king. The village of Domremy lay quiet under a veil of early morning mist, nestled between undulating fields and thick, dark forests. It was the kind of place where life followed the rhythm of the seasons, and every sound, be it a church bell or the creak of a cartwheel, echoed across the valley like a hymn. Smoke rose gently from thatched roofs as the first rays of sunlight brushed the dew-kissed meadows. Joan's world was small yet vibrant. As the youngest child of Jacques and Isabel, she was accustomed to simple routines, fetching water, tending to chickens, and learning prayers from the village priest. Her family's cottage, made of timber and wattle, smelled of earth and smoke. She loved the comforting scent of her mother's freshly baked bread, mingling with the tang of burning firewood. That morning, Joan woke before the rooster crowed. She dressed quickly, pulling the linen dress over her head, its fabric rough but familiar. Outside, the world still slumbered. Stars lingered in the pale sky as she crossed the yard to the animal shed. The goat bleated softly as she filled its trough. A thin fog curled around her feet, making the morning feel like a dream. When Joan returned inside, her mother was already working the dough. "Joan, fetch some water, child," Isabel said, smiling warmly. Joan nodded, grabbing the wooden bucket and stepping back into the cool dawn. As she walked to the well, she passed Jacques, who knelt by a broken cartwheel. His hammer struck iron against wood, ringing like distant church bells. "Careful with the bucket. It's heavy," he said without looking up. At the well, Joan pulled the rope with practiced ease, the bucket groaning as it rose, dripping and full. She paused, her gaze drifting toward the church tower. There was something about the silhouette of the cross against the rising sun that stirred her heart. It was as though a quiet voice whispered, just beyond her hearing, calling her to something greater than this humble village life. She didn't understand it yet, but the feeling lingered, like the echo of a prayer unanswered. Back at the cottage, Joan set the water down by the hearth. "Thank you, dear," Isabel said, wiping flour from her hands. She studied Joan for a moment, noticing the distant look in her daughter's eyes. "You've been spending a lot of time near the church lately," she remarked gently. "I like it there," Joan said softly. "It feels safe," her mother chuckled. "The house of God is always safe, but don't forget, you are still young. There is much work to be done before you can daydream about saints and angels." Joan smiled faintly, but her mind wandered back to the stories she'd heard during Mass. Stories of Saint Catherine, who endured persecution for her faith, and Saint Michael, the mighty archangel who fought evil. Joan often wondered what it would be like to live with such divine purpose. When her chores were done, she slipped away to sit by the small church at the edge of the village. The priest, a kindly old man, approached her with a smile. "Good morning, Joan," he said. "Good morning, Father," she replied, standing and bowing her head as he blessed her. "You seem thoughtful today," he observed. "I was just thinking about God," Joan said, "and about the stories you tell in Mass. Do you think God still speaks to people, Father? Like he did with the saints?" The priest looked at her kindly, Of course, my child. God speaks to those with hearts pure enough to hear him. Joan looked down at her hands, pale and calloused from farm work, fing-treaken, and thought of the strange stirring in her heart. She could not explain it, but she felt certain that something awaited her beyond Domremy, a calling only she could fulfill. That evening, as the sun set and the village was bathed in golden light, Joan sat by the fire, listening to the distant hoot of an owl. Her father mended a bridle while her mother hummed softly, folding the baked bread into cloth. The warmth of home surrounded her, yet her thoughts drifted again to the cross on the church tower. She clasped the small wooden cross around her neck and whispered a silent prayer. The golden haze of late afternoon bathed Domremy in warmth. As Joan finished her chores, with the sun dipping low, she quietly excused herself from the hum of the cottage and wandered toward the edge of the village. She walked barefoot, the grass still soft and cool, her hand closing around her cross, a simple act that always brought comfort. The great oak tree at the field's border was her sanctuary, its boughs a cathedral roof high above. Beneath it, she knelt in the tall grass, eyes closed, whispering the words of a prayer she'd learned as a child, but now carried new, desperate urgency. Lord, watch over France, end our suffering. If I am meant to serve, show me the way. A hush fell. The breeze stopped. Even the birds seemed to hold their breath. Then a radiant light, at once gentle and overwhelming, enveloped Joan. The colors of the world faded, replaced by gold and white. Out of this glow stepped Saint Michael, a figure of impossible majesty, armor agleam as if it held the sun inside it. His wings, more beautiful than any tapestry, stretched wide, and he gazed at Joan not as a stranger, but as an old friend. "Joan, daughter of God, you are chosen," he declared, his voice resonant as organ music. "France is in grave peril. You must save her." Joan stared, heart pounding, afraid and yet unafraid. "But I am only a girl," she whispered. "I do not know how to fight." "Why me?" Michael smiled, not with his lips but with his eyes. "God chooses not the mighty but the willing. Your faith is stronger than any sword." At his side appeared Saint Catherine, radiant and kind, her presence like spring after a hard winter. She knelt beside Joan, her hand warm on Joan's shoulder. "You are not alone," Catherine soothed. "We will guide you. Listen to the voices that come to you, ours and the Lord's. Trust what you know is true, even if the world laughs. Go to the Dauphin, Charles, for he is the rightful king of France." Joan's questions tumbled out. How could she leave home? Who would believe her? The saints listened with patience. "Heaven will open the way," Catherine assured. "Your courage will be tested, but God's hand will never leave you." The vision began to fade. The light softened. The world's sounds slowly returned. Joan's face was wet with tears. Tears not just of awe, but of certainty. She knew she had seen true messengers of God. For a long time she knelt, the grass pressing into her knees, her heart pounding. When at last she stood, her legs trembled, but her will did not. She gazed up through the oak's branches. At the first stars appearing, she felt both heavy with destiny and lighter than air. As she returned to the cottage, her mother's worried eyes met her in the doorway. "You've been praying a long while, Joan," Isabel said gently. Joan nodded, unable to share what had happened. Not yet. That night, she lay awake as the moon rose, clutching her cross, the saint's words echoing in her mind. She had been called. She would answer. Summer's fullness lingered in Domremy, the meadows heavy with wildflowers, and the air thick with the sounds of distant cattle. Joan worked as always, hands busy with chores, but her heart no longer belonged to the rhythms of village life. Since the day beneath the oak, the voices of the saints had returned, sometimes soft as a lullaby, sometimes with urgent insistence. "Go, save France. Seek the Dauphin." For weeks, Joan struggled with the knowledge she was given. the secret too heavy to keep, too wild to share. She feared her family would not believe her, or worse, that they would. Yet the saints were insistent. Tell them, be brave. This is God's will, not yours. On a morning shimmering with dew, Joan steeled herself and approached her mother as Isabel kneaded dough at the wooden table. "Mama, may I speak with you?" she asked, her hands twisting her apron. Isabel wiped her hands and sat beside Joan. "Of course, child. What troubles you?" Joan's voice was barely above a whisper at first, but as she spoke of the vision, the golden light, the great saints, the voices that called her to deliver France, her words grew steadier. Isabel listened in shock, her eyes wide with wonder and fear. Tears fell, her hands trembling as she drew Joan close. "Joan, these are dangerous times. The English, I know, Mama, but the voices say it must be me. I cannot ignore them." Later that evening, as Joan confessed the same truth to her father, Jacques' reaction was harsh and immediate. "Nonsense," he roared, pounding the table. "Visions? From God? Such things are for priests and kings, not for girls. You will stay here, Joan. Do you hear me? We have already lost too much to war. I will not lose you to madness." The argument echoed through the cottage long after night had fallen. Joan retreated to her straw mat, tears soaking her pillow, her cross pressed tightly in her hand. Still, the saints' voices would not leave her in peace. The next morning, desperate for guidance, Joan sought out the village priest. She waited for him by the old stone church, the air still and full of birdsong. When he arrived, she knelt at his feet, pouring out her soul, the visions, the commands, the sense of destiny she could not ignore. The priest listened, grave and silent. At last he spoke. "Child, there have been many in history who claimed to hear God. Some were mad, some were liars, but some were truly chosen. Tell me, do you doubt yourself?" Joan shook her head, her eyes shining. "Father, I am afraid, but I do not doubt," he nodded. "You are not the first to be afraid. Even the Virgin Mary trembled before her destiny. I will pray for you, Joan. Be cautious and be certain, for if this is God's will, no man can stand in its way. But if not, much harm may come." Reassured but sobered, Joan returned home, her resolve hardening. At sunset, she entered the little church alone. She lit a candle and knelt before the altar, her eyes on the battered crucifix above. "Lord, if this is madness, take it from me. But if it is truly your will, give me the strength to obey." Outside, the village seemed unchanged. Cows in the fields, smoke from chimneys, laughter in the distance. Yet Joan knew her world had shifted forever. That night, in the silence of her small bed, she whispered the saints' names and let their courage become her own. She would obey, whatever it cost. The dawn broke chill and gray as Joan slipped quietly from the cottage. Today was the day she had decided to leave Domremy behind, not as a girl, but as a messenger of God and a soldier. The saints' voices had become insistent, their commands clear. She could not appear before the men of the world as a simple village maiden. She must travel as one of them, protected by their customs, armored by their rules. In the kitchen, Joan found her mother's sewing shears, and with trembling fingers hacked at her hair. Auburn strands fell in clumps to the earthen floor. She barely recognized herself in the battered mirror, her face framed now by a boyish crop, the curve of her neck. Her hands trembled only once, but her resolve never did. She prayed softly as the hair fell. "Saint Michael, Saint Catherine, give me courage." When her brothers awoke, she stood in the doorway, dressed in Jacquemine's old tunic and Pierre's patched breeches, cinched at the waist with a battered belt. The boots were too large, but she stuffed them with straw. Her brothers stared, mouths agape. "Joan?" Jacquemine asked, his voice caught between laughter and fear. "I am still your sister," Joan replied, her voice clear. "But I am called to go where no girl is safe. God commands, and I must obey." The family watched in heavy silence, as Joan crossed the village square toward the blacksmith's forge. The blacksmith was a mountain of a man, his skin darkened by fire, his eyes sharp with questions. He measured her, murmuring disbelief, but when Joan told him her mission, he grew solemn. "It is a strange world when a girl must fight," he said, fitting a battered breastplate to her chest, hammering at the dents and oiling the leather straps. "But I see fire in you, lass. Maybe you are what France needs." Strapping on the armor, Joan felt the full weight of her calling, each buckle and rivet a link in the chain of her destiny. She practiced walking in the courtyard, rolling her shoulders, keeping her steps wide and strong. The boys watched her, pride growing in their eyes, as she learned to move as a soldier would. Isabel, her mother, wept quietly by the doorway, torn between pride and terror. Jacques could not bring himself to speak, haunted by the memory of the daughter he was losing and the strange, armored figure she was becoming. That night, Joan lay awake in her new garb, the wooden cross pressed against her heart beneath the rough tunic. She knew the road ahead would be dangerous, that every step she took would invite judgment, scorn, or worse. But the voices had told her, "You must go dressed as a man. Only then will you reach the Dauphin. Only then will you be heard in the pale moonlight." She whispered her fears and her hopes. Her prayers were for her family, her country, and her own uncertain future. She was not the first girl to cut her hair or wear a man's clothes, but she knew she was called to a purpose greater than disguise, a purpose that would soon shake the world. When morning broke, she shouldered her pack and stepped into the road, every movement foreign but right. She felt the eyes of Domremy on her, some filled with condemnation, others with admiration. But most important, she felt the silent presence of her saints, guiding each step. Joan of Arc, peasant girl, now walked the first miles of her journey as a soldier of God. The river journey to Chinon was long and fraught with peril. Muddy roads and the threat of bandits made each day a trial. But Joan pressed on, her battered boots caked with the memory of every mile. Word of the girl in armor had already begun to swirl in taverns and churches along the Loire, and at every stop, children peered from windows while old men made the sign of the cross. At last, the spires of Chinon Castle rose above the river mist. Solid, imposing, the seat of the would-be king. Joan's heart pounded as the drawbridge lowered, and guards in polished breastplates eyed her with suspicion. "What business brings a peasant girl in armor to the Dauphin's court?" one demanded, laughter barely hidden in his voice. "I come by God's command," Joan answered. "Let me speak to your king, for I have words only he must hear." Her voice, though tired, did not waver. The guards hesitated, thrown off by her confidence and the battered men who flanked her. Inside the outer courtyard, Joan's presence caused a sensation. Pages, ladies, and armored men pressed close, some laughing, others sneering. A few watched her with sharp, thoughtful eyes. Rumors flew. Some called her a witch, others a saint, and a few a dangerous fool. Joan ignored them all, focused only on the promise she carried and the mission that burned in her chest. When at last she was led into the candlelit grand hall, the air was thick with incense and intrigue. At the far end, Charles VII sat surrounded by advisors and nobles, dressed no finer than any other man present. The Dauphin's advisors had disguised him, hiding the royal insignia, and had placed another in the place of honor to test the girl's visions. Joan stood at the threshold, heart racing. The courtiers eyed her as an amusing diversion, a peasant's daughter come to play at prophecy. But Joan surveyed the faces, ignoring the trappings of rank, letting her heart and faith guide her. She walked past the false king, without so much as a glance, and approached Charles himself, falling to one knee. "Gentle Dauphin, my lord," she said clearly, her voice ringing through the hall. "I am Joan the Maid. God has sent me to lead you to Reims and see you crowned King of France." Gasps rippled through the chamber. The disguised king stared in wonder, searching Joan's face for trickery. She met his gaze unflinching, and the two studied each other in silence. The battered peasant and the uncertain prince, the courtiers muttered, some mocking, others suddenly uneasy. The archbishop leaned in, eyes narrowed. Charles's advisor, de la Trémoille, whispered warnings of fraud and witchcraft. Yet Charles, for all his doubts, felt the force of Joan's presence, a sense of honesty, of conviction that neither courtly training nor clever lies could produce. Later, in private, Charles summoned Joan to his inner chambers. She spoke with such confidence, describing her visions, revealing secrets only he and God could know, that the Dauphin's doubts began to erode. He studied her battered armor and youthful face and wondered aloud, could this simple maid truly be the deliverer of France? Joan answered only with the truth. It is not by my hand, but by God's will. I am his instrument, nothing more. But I will not fail you, so long as you trust him. The days that followed were filled with suspicion and tests. Joan was questioned by bishops, examined by doctors, watched closely by all. Some were eager to trip her up, to expose her as a fraud, but time and again, her answers confounded them. I do not know letters, she told the scholars, but I know my Lord's voice. Slowly, the tide turned. Charles's advisors, faced with the maid's persistence and the crumbling morale of the French army, urged the Dauphin to grant her command. As Joan knelt before Charles, now dressed in his true finery, she repeated her vow, God has sent me to deliver Orleans and crown you in Reims. Trust in him, and you shall be king. Charles's voice shook as he raised her up. Then go, maid of God, and may he protect you. That day, the court whispered of miracles and madness, of saints and charlatans. But one thing was certain. Joan the maid, against every expectation, had won the faith of a king. The first day in the armory felt more like a ritual than a fitting. The room echoed with the ring of hammers and the hiss of hot iron plunged into water as Joan stood in her underclothes, shivering not from cold, but from the enormity of the moment. She was no longer a girl in homespun, but a commander-to-be. As the door opened and the royal armorers entered with their tools, she straightened, heart pounding. Hold still, maid, the master armorer said gently, and with the help of his assistants began to fit her for the suit that would become as much a symbol as a shield. First came the padded gambeson, wrapped tightly about her frame, then the chainmail hauberk, its weight a new kind of embrace. Joan hardly dared to breathe. Every piece was measured for her, the breastplate polished until she could see her own anxious face, the articulated gauntlets crafted to hold not a ladle or spindle, but a sword. As they worked, the room filled with quiet awe. The squires whispered that this was no ordinary commission. The maid's armor would be seen by the king himself and by all of France. Joan's hands trembled only once, when the heavy steel was fastened across her chest. In that instant, she felt the full weight of her destiny, literal and spiritual, settle on her shoulders. Just as the armorers finished the last greave, the chaplain arrived, swinging a silver censer, filling the room with holy smoke. He dipped his fingers in the holy water and began to chant, Benedic Domine Arma Ista. He blessed every plate and joint, every strap and buckle, sprinkling the armor, Joan's sword, and then Joan herself. The old prayers mingled with the new hope in every heart. Joan lowered her head as the priest's hand traced a cross on her brow with oil. Go forth, maid of God, he intoned. Let this armor be your shield, your faith be your breastplate, and the Lord your guide. The armor was heavy, but Joan carried it with surprising ease, fueled by the certainty of her calling. She thanked the armorer and the priest, in turn, her voice calm and clear. You have made me ready, she told them, but it is God who fights. Word of the maid's blessing spread through the camp like wildfire. Some scoffed at the sight of a peasant girl in knight's garb. Others wept openly, believing a prophecy fulfilled. Even hardened veterans crossed themselves as she walked past, her helmet tucked under one arm, her eyes set on the chapel, where she would pray for the strength to lead men into battle. Later, as dusk fell, Joan knelt alone in her armor at the altar, torchlight glinting from polished steel. She prayed for courage, for wisdom, for her soldiers, and for France. Her heart overflowed with gratitude and awe. Never before had a girl like her worn such armor. Never before had a peasant's daughter become a commander by the blessing of both king and church. As she rose, fastening her helmet, she glimpsed her reflection once more in the shining steel. For the first time she saw not just Joan the farm girl, but Joan the maid, chosen, armored, and ready. The stench of smoke, sweat, and fear hung thick over the city of Orléans as Joan approached, her armor shining like a beacon through the battered gates. The city, ringed by English earthworks and broken by months of siege, seemed ready to fall until the maid arrived. Word spread ahead of her like a summer wind. The girl sent by God, the maid of Lorraine, had come to save them. At the sight of Joan's white banner, the weary defenders left their posts and gathered in the square. Children clambered atop walls. Old women wept, and soldiers who had nearly abandoned hope now beat their swords against shields in salute. Joan rode with poise, far beyond her 16 years, her helmet tucked beneath one arm. She met the city's commanders, Roux, including Jean de Dunois, the bastard of Orléans. He greeted her with skepticism, but her gaze, calm, clear, and utterly resolute, shook his doubts. "The time for fear has passed," she told him. "God has brought me here for victory." She toured the battered ramparts, listening closely to every officer, asking questions with the curiosity of a peasant and the authority of a general. Where others saw despair, she spoke only of deliverance. "You will not die in Orléans," she promised. "You will live to see your king crowned and France free again." As night fell, Joan joined the soldiers around their meager fires. She ate coarse bread and salt pork, shared stories, and prayed beside the wounded and the lost. Her faith was infectious. "I have seen the saints," she told the youngest. "They have not forsaken us, and neither will God." In the coming days, Joan's presence transformed the city. She insisted on purging it of vice, expelling prostitutes from the camps, banning cursing and gambling. She spent long hours in prayer, inviting the men to join her, and many did. Commanders, once skeptical, began to trust her insight. When the attacks began, Joan rode at the very front, her banner always visible above the melee. She did not carry a sword. She claimed her weapon was faith. In one fierce assault on the English-held Bastille of Saint-Loup, Joan was struck by an arrow in the shoulder. She staggered back, the wound bleeding freely, and for a moment the French wavered. But Joan returned to the ramparts before nightfall, her armor bloodied, her banner held even higher. "Do not despair," she shouted. "The victory is ours if you will only trust God." Her pain became a rallying cry, and the soldiers surged forward, capturing the fortress in a storm of fire and steel. Day after day, Joan led the assaults, on the Tourelles, on English strongholds up and down the riverbank. Her courage seemed to shield her from harm. Her faith burned so brightly that men swore the English arrows could not find her. Hope on the morning of May Bath. After a final desperate attack, the English abandoned their siege and retreated. Bells rang out from every tower. Men embraced in the streets, weeping with relief and disbelief. Joan, exhausted but smiling, knelt in the cathedral and gave thanks to God. The people of Orléans hailed her as their savior, and even the cynical Dunois knelt to kiss her banner. The maid's prophecy had come true. Orléans was delivered. For the first time in years, France dared to hope. The city of Orléans had awakened that morning as if from a nightmare. The English banners that for months had fluttered in threat now lay trampled and torn, along the ramparts. Smoke still curled from battered towers, but the air rang with peals of victory bells. The people crowded the streets, drawn by a mix of wonder and disbelief, desperate to see the maid who had delivered them from the jaws of death. Joan rode slowly at the head of her army, her banner streaming above her like a sliver of heaven. Her armor was dented and streaked with soot, but to the people of Orléans, she shone brighter than the morning sun. Men and women surged forward, their hands outstretched, some simply wanting to brush her stirrup, others falling to their knees, murmuring prayers and thanks. Children darted alongside her, their laughter rising above the clamor, and one small girl pressed a garland of wildflowers into Joan's hands. Everywhere she looked, eyes brimmed with tears. Old soldiers and mothers, priests and bakers. Some could only shake their heads in awe, whispering, "A miracle, a miracle." Even the city's hardened commanders seemed changed. Jean de Dunois, once skeptical, now bowed as she passed. "You are our deliverer, Maid of Lorraine," he declared loudly, his voice trembling with gratitude. The soldiers cheered, the sound rolling down the avenues like thunder. Joan dismounted at the city square, moving among the wounded, blessing those who had fallen, comforting the dying, her hands gentle as she whispered prayers for their souls. She hugged the living, urging them to keep faith, her exhaustion forgotten, as she drew on the boundless energy of relief and gratitude swirling around her. Townsfolk pressed bread and fruit into her hands, offerings of thanks from those who had nothing else. She smiled and distributed the gifts among the most hungry soldiers. "It was God's victory, not mine," she insisted to all, her voice clear above the jubilant noise. "We have been saved by His mercy and by your courage." As the sun dipped low, the city's bells rang anew. The people crowded into the cathedral for a mass of thanksgiving, the grand nave overflowing. Joan entered last, her banner lowered, and knelt at the altar in her battered armor, her head bowed, shoulders shaking with tears. She prayed aloud, "O Lord, you have heard our cries. Bless this city, and let peace grow from our suffering." The townsfolk knelt with her, a sea of hope and humility. For one shining evening, Orléans was united, not by fear, but by faith and the promise of deliverance. That night, as torches flickered along the city's ramparts, Joan walked the walls with Dunois and her captains, her gaze drifting out toward the empty enemy camps. The English were gone, and France, if only for a night, was whole again. "Sleep, Joan," Dunois urged, seeing her weary eyes. "You have done what no man could." But Joan shook her head, watching the stars appear above the battered city. "It was not by my hand," she said quietly. "It was God's will and the courage of this people. Now we must see our king crowned, and all of France free." In that moment, the Maid of Orléans became more than a legend. She became the hope of a nation. The victory at Orléans was only the beginning. With English strongholds faltering, Joan urged Charles to press on, not to rest until he was crowned in the ancient city of Reims. The journey was perilous. Hostile towns, enemy patrols, and the ever-present threat of betrayal. But Joan's faith lit the way. Wherever her banner appeared, gates opened and hearts softened. In the golden dawn of July Shuqi, the procession reached Reims. The city's towers soared above vineyards and fields, its bells ringing wild with anticipation. Thousands gathered to watch the battered but triumphant army, many waving scraps of linen or bouquets of wildflowers in greeting. At their head rode Joan, her banner bright as hope itself, a living promise fulfilled. As Charles dismounted before the great cathedral, he turned to Joan, his face pale but proud. "Maid, I would not be here but for you," he whispered. "You are here by God's will," Joan replied, her voice quiet and strong. "Now claim the crown that is rightfully yours, for all of France watches." Inside the cathedral, sunlight streamed through stained glass, bathing the nave in jewels of color. The archbishop stood at the altar, his voice trembling with age and awe as he began the sacred rite. Nobles and knights knelt in rows, banners shimmering, the great organ resounding through stone arches. Joan remained beside Charles throughout, eyes fixed on the proceedings, her hands gripping her banner as if to channel all the faith of France into this one moment. As the archbishop anointed Charles with holy oil and placed the golden crown upon his brow, a hush fell over the crowd. Charles closed his eyes, shoulders trembling. Joan could not contain her tears. Prus, they spilled silently down her cheeks, glinting on her armor. "My king!" she murmured as Charles rose, newly crowned. For a breathless instant, the world seemed still. The first true king of France in a generation stood beneath the ancient arches, sunlight blazing around his head. The Pretifa Pican Utif, the soldiers of Caerchens. The silence broke as nobles and soldiers erupted in cheers, voices echoing through the cathedral and out into the city. Bells tolled, trumpets blared, and the banners of France, blue, white, and gold, danced in the light. And Joan turned to Charles, kneeling with her banner. "Sire, the will of God is done. Let France be free and united under your reign." The king, moved beyond words, took her hand and lifted her to her feet. "Without you, I would be nothing," he whispered. Outside, the people of Reims surged forward, waving, laughing, and crying all at once. They pressed forward to touch Joan's armor, to offer blessings and thanks, to kneel at her feet. The story of the Maid of Orléans, now the Maid of Reims, spread faster than any messenger, kindling rebellion in hearts still under English rule. That night, the city was a blaze of torchlight and music. Joan withdrew to a quiet chapel, her prayers filled with gratitude and worry for what was to come. True, Paul. She knew her journey was not at its end. Battles still raged, the English still plotted, and the path of righteousness was never straight. But on this day, France had a king, and hope had a name. Joan's victory at Orléans and the king's coronation transformed her overnight from a country girl to a figure of myth. Her fame raced ahead of her wherever she traveled. Towns that once closed their gates in fear now opened them in festival, their streets swept and garlanded with flowers. As the Royal Army advanced, villagers lined the roads to catch a glimpse of the maid in shining armor. Children pressed wildflowers into her hands, and mothers begged for her blessing on their infants. The sick called out for her prayers. The old wept at the sight of her, some claiming to see a halo about her head. Joan, both shy and resolute, accepted every greeting with humility. "It is not I who saves," she reminded them gently, "but God, whose will I serve." Yet not all were so welcoming. Many nobles, threatened by Joan's popularity and the king's reliance on her advice, whispered that she was too bold, too strange, too powerful for a peasant. In council, she was tested by trick questions, and some sought to trip her up with debates about theology or war. But Joan met each test with a simple honesty and a certainty that defied tradition. "I do not know the ways of books," she answered one lord, "but I know the voice of my saints, and I know what is right." As the royal army passed through liberated towns, Joan made time for the poor and the voiceless. She listened to their needs of failing crops, unjust taxes, or soldiers who had stolen bread or livestock, and she took their pleas to the king. "Your people cry out for justice," she told Charles. "It is your duty, as God's chosen king, to hear them." The king, still uncertain but learning from her courage, began to listen. Her kindness was as famous as her valor. In the camps, she insisted on prayer and discipline, forbidding gambling, drunkenness, and swearing. She shared meals with common soldiers and visited the wounded, her words healing as much as her presence. Word of the maid traveled across the sea. In English-held towns, children sang songs about her. English generals called her a witch, while soldiers feared her banner more than 1,000 knights. In distant kingdoms, ambassadors wrote of the miracle of the peasant girl who had saved France. Some in Rome whispered that she might be a new saint. For Joan, fame was a trial as well as a blessing. She saw that some wished only to profit from her story or use her for their own ambitions. She felt the weight of every expectation, the hopes of a nation, the scrutiny of the powerful, the jeers of the envious. Yet she bore it with humility, insisting always that she was but a servant. At night, as the army camped beneath the stars, Joan slipped away to pray alone. She thanked God for every soul she had helped, and asked only for the wisdom to do His will. Her saints visited her in visions, sometimes reassuring, sometimes warning, beware pride. Stay true to your mission. Through it all, Joan's legend grew. For the people of France, she was not merely a commander, but a living sign that God had not forgotten them. Mothers named their daughters after her. Children dreamed of following her into battle, and Joan, ever faithful, pressed on, her heart fixed on her mission, her eyes always on the cross. The fields around Compiègne were already heavy with the scent of summer. When Joan arrived at the beleaguered city, she found it surrounded by enemy camps, the banners of Burgundy flapping in the humid wind. Within the city walls, fear gnawed at the hearts of soldiers and townsfolk alike. Joan rode the ramparts each morning, her battered armor shining where it could, her voice strong as she reassured the weary. "Take courage," she told them. "God has not abandoned you. Hold fast, and we shall prevail." Each day brought new skirmishes, shouts and clashing steel echoing through the fields. Joan led her men into the fray with courage that bordered on reckless. Her banner always raised above the melee, a symbol of hope for the defenders and a challenge to the besiegers. On the evening of May Assassin, word reached Joan that the enemy had grown careless at their outposts. Ever the bold strategist, she rallied her captains and led a sortie across the causeway, her horse plunging through mud and riverbank reeds, her voice clear above the clash of arms. The French struck hard, scattering the Burgundians in the first rush, but the tide quickly turned. A mass of enemy reinforcements poured across the fields, horns blaring, steel glinting in the last light of day. "Fall back," Joan ordered, even as she held the line, swinging her sword and crying encouragement. She counted her men as they retreated toward the gates, refusing to abandon even the wounded. As chaos erupted, French defenders streamed back across the drawbridge. But fear, or perhaps treachery, led the city's commander to order the gates closed before all could return. Joan found herself on the wrong side of the gates, a small group of knights at her back, enemy soldiers closing in from all sides. She fought bravely, parrying blows, her banner still visible above the melee. But there were too many. Her horse was pulled down, and strong arms seized her, wrenching her to the ground. The Burgundians roared with triumph as they recognized the maid. She was bound, her sword and banner torn away. As the captors led her away, she looked back one last time at the city she had tried to save. Also, her heart was heavy, not with fear for herself, but with sorrow for those she could no longer protect. Inside Compiègne, word of Joan's capture spread like wildfire. Men cursed and wept. Women dropped to their knees in prayer. Some swore vengeance. Others whispered that this must be God's will. Among the Burgundians, a grim satisfaction spread. At last, the English and their allies had their prize. That night, as she lay shackled and watched by hostile guards, Joan prayed as she always did, asking for strength not for herself, but for her king, her soldiers, and her beloved France. After the chaos of her capture, Joan was paraded before her enemies, a prized trophy of war. The English and their Burgundian allies transported her under heavy guard to Rouen, a stronghold deep in enemy territory. She was thrown into a dungeon far from the fields and sky she loved, locked in darkness, surrounded by stone and stench. Her cell was cold and wet, the straw mattress alive with vermin, the only light a thin beam that crept through a slit in the wall. Shackles chafed her wrists and ankles, and even at night, guards stood watch, refusing her any privacy. The jeers and taunts came often. "Where are your voices now, maid?" sneered one. "Will God send angels to open your chains?" mocked another. Sometimes, a younger guard would stare at her in silence, haunted by the legend he'd grown up hearing. Joan looked each man in the eye, her voice calm and unwavering. "God is with me, even in this prison. You may hold my body, but you cannot chain my soul." Days blurred into weeks. The English commanders visited her, some in awe, others seeking any flaw in her resolve. Pierre Cochon, the Bishop of Beauvais, took charge of her fate. He arrived in the torchlit gloom, robes gleaming in the shadows, eyes cold as flint. "Joan," he intoned, "you will answer for your heresies before the Holy Church. Repent, and perhaps your life will be spared." Joan answered him in the language of saints and scripture. "I am guided by God, and I have done nothing but His will." No threat or bribe could move her. Loneliness weighed heavy on her. Joan missed the wind in the fields, the laughter of her brothers, the songs of Mass. She comforted herself with prayers, whispering the names of Saint Michael and Saint Catherine. Sometimes she sang quietly, old hymns of hope remembered from childhood. When the darkness pressed hardest, she scratched tiny crosses into the damp stone with a bit of bone she found on the floor. Nights were worst. Shadows stretched long, and the scurrying of rats mocked her with thoughts of freedom lost. But Joan never allowed despair to fully take root. She found strength in the knowledge that her suffering had meaning, that she bore it for her king, her country, and her God. "I would rather die than betray my mission," she whispered to the dark. On rare mornings, she glimpsed sunlight through the slit high in her cell. On those days, Joan closed her eyes and imagined she was in Domremy, the fields golden, her mother calling her to breakfast, the church bells ringing. She smiled at the memory, holding it close like a prayer. The world outside grew ever more distant, yet word of Joan's courage crept even into the court of the king. Some in France mourned, some plotted rescue, but most prayed for the maid in her chains. Joan's days and nights in prison blurred together, but the worst ordeal came when the bishop's men summoned her to face her inquisitors. She was led from her cell in chains, her feet shuffling across cold stone, her wrists sore from iron cuffs. Outside, a damp chill hung in the corridors. When the guards pushed open the doors to the makeshift tribunal, Joan stood before an audience that stretched to the far walls. A semicircle of clerics and scholars, their faces a mixture of scorn, curiosity, and cold calculation. At their center sat Pierre Cochon, flanked by senior theologians and notaries. In front of them, a table stacked with scrolls, legal texts, and quills, as if the weight of all law and learning was gathered to break her. The English and their allies watched from behind a velvet rope, ready to claim victory. The questioning began at dawn and stretched into dusk. Day after day, the clerics hammered her with demands. How did she know her voices were from God? Why did she dare wear men's clothing? Did she submit to the authority of the church over her visions? Had she sinned by fighting and shedding blood? Joan's answers, recorded by trembling scribes, became legend. "My voices are from God," she declared. "He has always been my guide, and I have always obeyed him. As to my dress, it is God's command, and for my own safety." When they pressed her to submit her will to the church, she answered with both respect and cunning, "I trust in God. If the church and God are one, then I obey both. If they are not, I obey God first." The tribunal tried every trick, repeating questions, seeking contradictions, even threatening her with torture and death. Yet Joan remained steadfast, sometimes confounding her judges with a wisdom far beyond her years. When one cleric demanded, "Are you in God's grace?" a question meant to trap her, Joan answered, "If I am not, may God put me there." The stanca sage. "If I am, may he keep me there. I would be the saddest creature alive if I were not in his grace," the court murmured. astonished at her wit. She endured questions not only about theology, but about her daily life, her letters to the English, her refusal to betray her saint's secrets. She refused to name the voices she heard, protecting her spiritual guides from the malice of men. Through it all, Joan kept her head high. Sometimes she wept with frustration. Sometimes she smiled at the folly of her interrogators. She prayed aloud for strength and patience, her chains clinking as she lifted her bound hands. The days were long, the air in the hall stifling. The faces of her enemies and judges blurred, but Joan's sense of purpose never did. When at last the session ended, Joan was dragged back to her cell, her body weak, but her spirit unbroken. Alone in the darkness, she whispered, "Saint Michael, Saint Catherine, give me courage. I will not deny you, no matter the cost." And so the questions continued, day after day, a battle of words and faith, more punishing than any field of war. By now, Joan's prison days blended into a haze of hunger, cold, and endless questioning. The faces of her interrogators blurred, but their voices never softened. Each session felt longer than the last. Still shackled, Joan was dragged before her judges, her legs trembling but her back straight, her cross hidden in her fist. Even as fever burned through her body, she refused to bend. Pierre Cochon loomed over her, his voice hard and brittle. "Joan, this is your last chance. Sign this abjuration. Confess your errors, and we will spare your life. Refuse, and you will burn for your heresies." He held out the parchment, already inked with threats and falsehoods. Joan stared at the document. The words blurred, lies against her voices, her clothing, her faith, her king. If she signed, she might live. But she would betray all she had fought for, her calling, her saints, and the men who had trusted her. She remembered the faces of her family, the cheers in Orléans, the prayers at Reims. She remembered the voices, clearer than ever in this hour of fear. She looked up, her voice rough but unbroken. "I will not lie, even to save my life. What I have done at God's command. If you must kill me, do so. But my soul is in God's hands." Some clerics looked away, their hands shaking. Some clerics looked away, their hands shaking. Others pressed harder, raising their voices. "If you are condemned," one whispered, "your name will be cursed, your memory erased." Joan's eyes flashed. "My name is in God's keeping, not yours." The day dragged on, her answers tested at every turn. "Why did you dress as a man?" "For my safety and God's will." "Why did you lead men in battle?" "God told me I must, and I obeyed." "Will you recant?" "I will not betray the truth for fear." At one point, exhaustion overcame her. She collapsed to her knees, breathing hard. But a Cochon signaled for a pause. But Joan, lifting her head, insisted she could continue. "I am tired in my body, not in my soul." As the hearing ended, she was dragged back to her cell, the voices of her judges following her like a curse. She lay shivering on the cold stone, but her heart remained a shield. That night, Joan whispered prayers for mercy, not for herself, but for France, for the king, and even for her enemies. "Forgive them, Lord," she murmured, "for they know not what they do. Give me strength to finish this trial." Her faith, battered but unbroken, would see her through one more night. Morning broke gray and cold, the sun a pale smear behind the clouds. In the stone corridors of Rouen, Joan was roused from uneasy sleep and given a cup of water. Her hands shook, but she finished her prayer, lifting her battered cross to her lips before the guards shackled her wrists once more. The church hall was colder still, the stone walls lined with flickering torches and somber faces. The crowd had gathered, clergy in their black and purple robes, English captains glaring from the back, curious townsfolk, and a few of Joan's jailers who had come to bear witness. She was led to a wooden platform, forced to kneel before the court. Bishop Cochon began to speak, his voice trembling only slightly as he read the long list of charges: heresy, relapsed error, stubbornness, pride. He declared her visions false and her voices evil. For these crimes, he intoned, you are excommunicated, cast out from the Holy Church, and delivered to the secular arm for punishment. Joan listened, her head bowed, lips moving in silent prayer. Only once did she raise her voice, clear and strong, echoing in the vast chamber. But all that I have done was by God's command. My voices are true. If I am condemned, it is because I have obeyed him, not men. Some clerics flinched at her words, crossing themselves or averting their eyes. Others glared at her, eager for the proceedings to end. Scribes scratched hurried notes onto parchment, recording her final stand. One young notary paused, tears sliding down his cheeks. The verdict was signed with shaking hands, the great seal pressed into the wax. Cochon offered Joan the final chance to recant. He leaned down, voice soft but urgent. Child, confess. Save your soul, if not your life. Joan looked up at him with infinite weariness and a quiet love. My soul is in God's keeping. I have nothing more to say. As the sentence was read, Joan felt a strange calm descend. She was afraid. Who would not be? But the terror was thin and far away, overshadowed by a peace she could not explain. She remembered the fields of Domremy, her mother's hands kneading bread, the bells at Reims, the banners of Orléans, her voices whispering in the silence. Guards took her arms and led her from the hall. As she passed the watchers, a few reached out, some to curse, but more to whisper prayers or weep. One Englishman, seeing the light in her eyes, muttered, "We are lost. We have condemned a saint." Outside, the square was already being prepared for the execution. Joan's step faltered, but she kept her head high. "Jesus," she whispered, "receive me that evening." As the verdict spread through Rouen, the city shuddered. Some cheered, some fell silent, some wept in hidden corners. In the darkness of her cell, Joan waited for dawn, knowing her trial on earth was ending. But her story had only begun. Night descended with a hush, draping the old fortress in shadow. In her stone cell, Joan listened to the sounds of the city as she had so many nights before. Distant bells, muffled voices, the echo of footsteps in stone corridors. She wrapped her arms around her knees, her shift thin against the chill, her cross pressed to her lips. "Jesus, Mary, Saint Michael, Saint Catherine," she whispered, "do not leave me now." For a long time, Joan wept quietly, letting the sorrow of all she had lost and all that was to come pass through her. Yet even in her fear, a strange peace filled her. Her journey was almost over. She had obeyed her voices, fought for her king, never betrayed her faith. Whatever awaited her at dawn, she knew her soul would be in God's hands. Near midnight, a gentle knock sounded at the cell door. A kind-faced priest slipped inside, carrying a candle that made the darkness dance on the walls. "Kisses, my child," he whispered. "I come to hear your confession if you wish." Joan nodded, grateful beyond words. She confessed her sins, her anger, her doubts, her moments of pride. The priest listened, tears streaking his cheeks, and gave her absolution. "You are a true daughter of God," he told her, voice trembling. "You have suffered much for the right. Fear not." "Heaven awaits," Joan asked for a cross, and the priest fashioned one from 2 sticks tied with thread. She kissed it and held it tightly. She begged for a mass to be said for her soul. "I forgive all who have harmed me," she said, her voice steady, "and I ask God to forgive me, too, for all my faults." When the priest left, the guard who stood watch all night, one who had never mocked her, paused at the door, his eyes shining with "Is there aught you wish, maid?" he asked in a whisper. Joan smiled, her face luminous in the candle light. "Only your prayers, kind friend." Left alone, Joan sang softly, an old hymn of hope, her voice thin but unwavering, echoing down the empty corridor. She prayed for her king, her soldiers, her family, and even her enemies. The candle guttered as dawn approached, the last night fading. As the city slept, Joan lay awake, her cross in her hands, her soul at peace. In her final prayers, she whispered, "Into your hands, O Lord, I commend my spirit." She was not afraid. The sky above Rouen was grey as iron. When the guards came for Joan, the city was hushed in mourning. Its people awake before dawn, many whispering prayers, or sobbing quietly in the shadows of narrow streets. In her small cell, Joan dressed in the white robe given her by her captors, a robe meant for penitent heretics. It was clean but coarse, scraping her thin skin, but she wore it with dignity. The heavy key turned in the door. "It is time," said the priest, voice breaking. Joan nodded and stood, crossing herself. Her wrists were bound with cord, but she walked without hesitation into the corridor, where a procession awaited, priests chanting prayers, monks swinging censers, guards flanking every step. Outside, the world was still, the early light cold on the faces of the waiting crowd. The path to the stake wound through Rouen's heart. As she walked, townsfolk pressed forward, many in tears, some dropping to their knees as Joan passed. "Forgive us!" one woman cried. Joan paused, leaning close, whispering, "I forgive you all. Pray for me and for France." Soldiers tried to keep order, shoving the crowd back, but many slipped through to grasp Joan's sleeve, or simply reach out a trembling hand. She walked on, head held high, lips moving in constant prayer. At the front of the procession, a priest bore a tall crucifix. "Keep it before me," Joan whispered. "Let me see my Savior to the end." The priest wept openly, lifting the cross higher. Children cried. Women fainted. Old men stood silently, hats in hand. Among the crowd, some English soldiers watched with dark faces, uncomfortable, shifting their feet. The procession reached the marketplace, where the pyre stood ready. A rough stake, surrounded by bundles of wood, a ladder propped against it, guards forming a ring. The executioner waited, eyes shadowed by his hood. Joan knelt for a final prayer, surrounded by priests. One last time, they begged her to recant. Joan shook her head, voice steady. "I have done nothing but God's will. I ask only that you pray for me." She stood, asking the priests for a cross. A sympathetic English soldier, moved by her courage, broke a stick and lashed it into a cross with thread. Joan kissed it, pressing it to her heart. She looked at the crowd in the sky and whispered, "Jesus, Jesus, Jesus." As she was led to the stake, the people of Rouen wept openly. Even some of the English turned away. Unable to meet her eyes, Joan mounted the pyre with the strength of a queen. She accepted her fate, knowing her journey was nearly done. Her heart was filled not with anger or fear, but forgiveness. The morning air in the marketplace was still and heavy as Joan was led to the stake. The pyre loomed at the center of the square, its wood stacked high, the executioner standing with his torch as priests circled, chanting prayers. All Rouen seemed gathered to witness the end of the Maid of Orléans. Villagers, soldiers, merchants, even nobles pressed close, faces wet with tears or pale with dread. Joan stepped onto the pyre with calm and dignity, her white robe billowing in the cold breeze. Her hands, freed for a moment, clutched the wooden cross that had been made for her, pressing it to her heart. A priest, braving the anger of the guards, held a larger crucifix aloft where Joan could see it. "Keep it high," she begged, "so I may see my Lord as I die." The priest wept, holding the cross aloft with shaking arms. As the executioner tied her to the stake with rough ropes and heavy chains, Joan gazed upward, her lips moving in constant prayer. The priests shouted encouragement. "Joan, think only of God. Bear this trial bravely, as you have all others." She nodded, her face pale but serene. When all was ready, the executioner, hands shaking, bent to touch his torch to the dry kindling at the base of the pyre. Flames sparked and curled, slow at first, then rising, hungrily licking the bundles of wood and straw. The smoke climbed quickly, gray and pungent, stinging the eyes of the crowd. As the fire grew, Joan's voice rang out, clear above the murmurs and the crackle. "Jesus! Jesus!" she called to her saints, to Mary, to the people of France, asking their prayers and forgiveness for her enemies. The flames rose higher, and her white robe caught the first embers, turning gold and then black as smoke wreathed her head. The crowd sobbed and shouted, some calling for mercy, others praying loudly, a few collapsing in grief. Even among the English, a hush spread. Some soldiers bowed their heads, others removed their helmets, unable to meet the girl's eyes as she faced the flames without fear. "Jesus!" Joan cried once more, her voice cracking but unwavering. "Jesus!" Her words echoed through the square, a final testament of faith and courage. The flames finally surged around her, the smoke rising to cover the stake, and Joan's voice faded, yet did not die. Those who watched swore they saw her face radiant and at peace. Even in death, the bells of Rouen tolled, and all who witnessed the martyrdom of the maid knew they had seen something holy. Long after the flames subsided, the people of Rouen remained in the square, rooted by sorrow and awe. Smoke curled around the blackened stake, twisting upward into the brightening morning. Where once a girl had stood, alive, brave, unbowed, only ashes remained. Yet, for many in the crowd, her presence lingered, filling the square with a peace that seemed to settle like dust in the golden sunlight. Some knelt, unable to rise. Old women wept openly, clutching rosaries. Men who had marched to war lowered their heads, unable to comprehend the loss. Children clung to their mothers, whispering questions. Why would God allow such a thing? Yet none doubted what they had seen. A soul unbroken, a martyr's courage. At the pyre's edge, the executioner sifted through the ashes, his hands shaking so badly he could scarcely hold the rake. A priest knelt beside him, murmuring prayers through his tears, making the sign of the cross over the ground. "Lord, receive your faithful servant," he whispered, and those nearby echoed the prayer. The English commanders stood apart, their faces hard. "Throw it all in the river," one ordered, his voice cold with fear and superstition. "Let no relic remain. Let her be forgotten." The guards hastily collected what little was left, ashes, bits of bone, scorched cloth, and carried it to the banks of the Seine. There, under the eyes of priests and townsfolk, they scattered everything into the water. The river carrying Joan's mortal remains far from the city. A hush fell, broken only by the sound of weeping and the tolling of the bells. Amid the silence, one English soldier, trembling, whispered, "We have burned a saint. God forgive us." Another, unable to bear it, threw his helmet to the ground and left, never again to speak of the day. As the morning wore on, the stories began soft at first, then louder. "Did you see her face?" She was smiling. Her voice did not falter. Even the flames seemed to bow before her. The tale of Joan's courage, her faith, her final words spread through Rouen and beyond. Some spoke of miracles, light that lingered, the scent of roses on the wind, a dove that rose above the smoke. Whether true or simply born of need, these whispers comforted the hearts of those who had lost hope. In the days and weeks that followed, pilgrims began to come to the square. They knelt where the stake had stood, prayed for France and for the soul of the maid. The English grew uneasy, sensing they had created not an end, but a beginning. For the people, Joan's death did not silence her. Her courage took root in their hearts, a seed of resistance and hope. "Remember the maid," they said, passing the story from mouth to mouth, from parent to child, from town to town. And in the silence after the flames, the world seemed to pause, as if listening for the whisper of a saint carried on the smoky air. After Joan's death, France mourned, but it did not forget. The city squares where her name was whispered in fear now rang with quiet prayers. Men and women, young and old, passed her memory from lips to ears, telling the tale of the maid who loved her country more than her own life. For years, Even in the darkest days, her spirit lived on, a secret source of strength for all who longed for justice. Charles VII, crowned in Reims by Joan's own hand, was not deaf to the outcry. Haunted by guilt and gratitude, he eventually ordered a retrial. Bishops, priests, and scholars assembled to review the evidence of Joan's life and death. Those who had known her, soldiers who had fought at her side, townsfolk from Domremy, even former captors, testified to her faith and innocence. In Echency by Ushaloup, 25 years after her execution, the retrial concluded. Joan of Arc was declared not a heretic, but a faithful daughter of the Church, her name restored, her soul exonerated. From that moment, Joan became more than a memory. She became a legend. In village churches and grand cathedrals, her story was told and retold. Painters and sculptors immortalized her in stained glass and marble, always with her banner, her sword, and her halo of light. Mothers named their daughters Jen in her honor. Soldiers whispered her prayers before battle. As the centuries passed, Joan's legend only grew. Her faith, her courage, and her sacrifice inspired new generations, not only in France, but around the world. During times of war, revolution, or despair, her name was invoked as a beacon of hope and resistance. Joan, who had died at 19, became a symbol for the ages. At the Vatican, her letters and testimonies were carefully studied by popes and bishops. In Echenjorbite Ursus, nearly 500 years after her death, Joan of Arc was officially canonized as a saint of the Catholic Church. The Church in Rouen, in Domremy, and in every corner of France, bells rang out in celebration. To this day, pilgrims travel from across the globe to the places Joan walked, to Domremy's fields and the church where she prayed, to Rouen's market square, where a simple cross stands as a reminder of courage in the face of cruelty. Children hear her story and imagine her in shining armor, unafraid before kings and armies. For some, Joan is a saint, for others, a patriot, for all, she is proof that faith and conviction can change the world. When the sun sets over Rouen, the statues of the Maid cast long shadows over the cobblestones. In the flickering candlelight of cathedrals, her face glows in the glass, young, strong, and radiant. Her banner, painted with lilies and light, waves on in the minds of all who remember. Joan of Arc, the Maid of Orléans, remains immortal, a daughter of God, a saint for all time, and the living legend of France. Thank you so much to all of you, my amazing audience, for watching and listening to my videos on this channel. Your time, support, and encouragement mean the world to me. Every view, every like, and every comment inspires me to keep creating content that brings joy, relaxation, and meaningful stories to your day. I feel truly blessed to have such wonderful viewers who are willing to share this journey with me. This channel exists because of you. Your support motivates me to work harder and continue improving each video I create. Whether you are here to relax, learn, or simply enjoy a quiet moment, I hope my videos bring something special to your life. Your presence is the reason this community continues to grow and thrive. I sincerely thank you for being part of this family. Please continue to share your thoughts, leave your feedback, and let me know what you'd like to see in the future. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. It truly helps this channel grow from the bottom of my heart. Thank you once again for watching, listening, and being with me on this journey.